Bill Watson here. Hope you're enjoying these podcasted Bible studies that we've arranged to conduct. You know, the Church of God International has always intended to try to utilize as much of the technology that we have and different methods and tactics that it provides to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And podcasting is really a very valid and legitimate method in utilizing the technologies that are at our disposal. However, podcasting does have its limitations, as you well know. Unlike webcasting, you can't really interact in real time. So what we've done, we've made arrangements whereby you can ask questions or make comments and send them to us via email. That's right, all you've got to do is go ahead and email us at billw@cgi.org, and hopefully this is going to enhance the educational value of the subject that we're covering as we go through the topics in a more specific way, being directed by your questions and your comments. So let's go ahead now, prepare to go back into the book that we're studying, and we'll look forward to your comments and questions. Just email us. Remember, email us at billw@cgi.org. So I want to continue in Daniel chapter 7, where we had left off, and pick up there in Daniel 7. And this will be basically part 2. If you haven't had part 1, I would strongly suggest to go back and listen to part 1, because this will connect up with that. In part 1, we kind of went back and forth a little bit, weaving in and out of some additional scriptures over there in Daniel 8 and Daniel 11. We went over into Jeremiah 50 and covered verses 17 through 20, where God references through the prophet Jeremiah this kingdom of Babylon and the fact of his concerns with regards to that, and trying to give us a more comprehensive overview of what Daniel 7 is taking us through, because you don't see or get verification of what we're reading in Daniel 7, verses roughly about 1 through about verse 7, until you begin to see how chapter 8 and chapter 11 also add in some of the fill that's necessary to identify what you're reading in Daniel 7, those first 7 verses. So I don't want to go back and reiterate the 3 previous beasts that we talked about in verses 1 through about 6, but I do want to pick up in verse 7, where we began to introduce ourselves to the 4th beast in this sequence of 4. We started out with a lion, we had a bear, and we had a leopard with 4 heads. That was 6 heads of the 7-headed beast. And then, of course, we have the 4th beast, which is, again, the 7th head of these beasts. And in verse 7, we pick it up, and we read, "After this I saw the night vision, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it. It was different, diverse, from all the beasts that were before it. It had 10 horns." So this was a bigger, more vicious beast in its own right, and consequently Daniel is trying to explain to us that this thing supersedes what was portrayed as the lion, the bear, and the leopard. Now, I want to bring your attention back. Remember, Daniel received this vision. This is not a dream by somebody else. This was not necessarily a dream per se. It was an actual vision that he had, and he had it, remember, in the 1st year of Belshazzar. That was the king of Babylon. If you recall, just putting things back in context, chapter 6 commenced the final invasion of the Medes and the Persians, taking Babylon down. And we start out in chapter 6, verse 1 with Darius, the king. We went through chapter 6, which was kind of a, for lack of a better term, an inset chapter. It broke basically, well, it actually is not an inset chapter in this respect. It is a continuation of chapter 5, which kind of ended the Babylonian kingdom, and then Darius, who was the king at that time, and remember he was Cyrus's uncle, and in this respect, he was the one actually that did the Babylonian takedown. But then in chapter 7, we go back to Babylon. So we were kind of taken up through to the invasion of the Medes and the Persians and the downfall of Babylon. But then in chapter 7, we go back and we're told about Daniel, who had a vision before Babylon fell in the first year of Belshazzar. And remember, Belshazzar ruled for about 10 years. So we actually, in chapter 7, go back probably 10 years before chapter 6. You with me? So that's kind of the timeline here in this regard. So Daniel's kind of patchwork a little bit as far as timeline's concerned, but the point of it is the content of what happened when it happened. When it happened is not so necessarily important as what he saw when it happened. And in chapter 7, we see now that he was given a vision of some very futuristic prophetic events that while he was still in Babylon at that time. So we see this beast described in verse 7. Verse 8 now, chapter 7, book of Daniel. I considered the horns. All right, it had 10 horns. So Daniel says, interesting. The leopard had 4 heads. The bear had 1 head. It had 3 ribs in its mouth. He saw all that. And that goes back up there to chapter 5, of which, verse 5, of which the bear is described there as the 3 ribs, and of which preceded the conquests of Cyrus with his kingdom, the Medes and the Persians. The leopard, of course, with the 4 heads, we understand Alexander fell, and then he has his 4 kings who took over that particular kingdom, Lasamachus, Cassander, we had Ptolemy, and then we had the 4th one, Seleucid, who were the 4 kings there that took over the kingdom of Alexander the Great, represented by the leopard. Now in verse 8 we read this, I considered the horns. So Daniel's considering the horns of verse 7 that he saw, and he says, behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So here he sees this infusion of this, or interphase with this little horn, that in this case, before whom were 3 of the first horns plucked up, which gives you the indication that the 3 that fell were part of the 10, inclusive of the 10. Years ago, we used to teach that those were the Vandals, the Herlii, and the Ostrogoths, who in their attempt to take Rome down, took Rome down because it's been understood, we'll get into this here in a moment, that the 4th beast does indeed represent the 4th main kingdom or empire following the Greco-Macedonians, and that would have been Rome, because history proves that 2 of Alexander the Great's generals, which were Ptolemy and Seleucid, represented this pattern that we see come back to us in chapter 11 as the king of the north and king of the south. Lysimachus and Cassander, they were morphed into those 2 remaining empires of Alexander the Great's empire from his 4 generals. And the Ptolemies were represented by Egypt, which represented the king of the south, and the Seleucids were represented by Syria, which represented the king of the north. Then Seleucid took over the Ptolemies, beat them up, and they morphed into Rome. And what became the king of the north wrapped around the Mediterranean Sea, and for all intents and purposes became that what we understand to be the king of the north. Now, in this particular verse 8 is an interesting thing, because we link this up over here to Revelation, and let me keep your finger in Daniel 7, because we'll come back to it, but I want to now integrate this Revelation 13 with this little horn, because you have a distinction of identifying what this little horn is, and of course, a separation of the statement of what this kingdom is that commenced description in verse 7 and 8. And we see in Revelation 13, as we're told about this beast in verses 1 through about 10, we see now in verse 11 an introduction of another beast. And coming up out of the earth, and he has two horns like a lamb, and he speaks as a dragon. The two horns certainly representative of the civil government and, of course, the ecclesiastical aspect of this. And he represents basically the two horns on this additional beast. He exercises all the power of the first beast. So there is some authority to execute legislation on the civil side of the coin, and has, in this particular case, a shared responsibility of actually executing civil law along with ecclesiastical law. Because we're told right here, he represents both sides of the coin. He's got two horns on him, and then verse 12, it's substantiated that he exercises all the power of the first beast. Well, who's the power of the first beast? That's described previous in verses 1 through 10 of the same chapter, Revelation 13. Let me go back. Revelation 13, and in verse 2, the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, a bear, and a lion. And the dragon, and we all understand who that dragon is, gave him powers. So this is a satanically driven Greco-Macedonian, Babylonian kingdom or civil government. That's what we're being told, because these very animals match up in reverse order: leopard, bear, lion, instead of lion, bear, leopard. Okay? Daniel 7, it's lion, bear, leopard. In Revelation, it's leopard, bear, lion. But here's the point. It's all of the same ilk. It's all from the same cloth. It is a description of John basically validating what was written by Daniel, in this case, some 600 years later. Some 600 years later that John is writing Revelation from when this original vision was given to Daniel back there in Daniel 7. Verse 3, Revelation 13, verse 3, I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death. His deadly wound was healed. All the world wondered after the beast. History again shows us the Roman Empire did have a downfall, the downfall of Rome. Everybody's aware that Rome fell. However, after the invasions of the Ostrogoths and the Vandals and the Heruli, these, what you could say, barbarians, for lack of a better term, invading Rome and taking out certain areas of the Roman Empire, it was indeed revived or brought back to life and revived by Justinian in around 554 AD. So there was a downfall. It was probably pretty lame there for maybe about 100 years or so, but then it revived back with what could be traceable through 7 resurrections going all the way back from Justinian forward to Garibaldi and Hitler and Mussolini and all of them. So we're up on the 7th one in the sequence, if indeed that would be the understanding that we could leverage from this. Point being, though, in this case, as we see here, ultimately the wound was healed, and the wound was healed in 554 AD. But even today, at this point, there's a lull in the storm. There is no virtually a Roman Empire, a conglomerate described as we see in Revelation 17. It's not here yet. Consequently, there is no real revival. There's no real revisitation of this Romanish government that Daniel was talking about back there in chapter 7. So he goes on, John does, and he tells us in verse 3, well, this wound is going to be healed. Later on, we see in Revelation 17 that this wounded beast actually comes on so strong that he virtually takes over the world. He combines 10 kings. They support him as one, and he drives dominance. He drives dominance through prosperity and economics as well as military prowess to essentially disrupt the whole world. changing even times and laws, and of which we're told, we'll see this in a moment in Daniel 7, where he actually prevails over the saints. And who are the saints? Christians. That's us. And so we know that we're talking about the end times because the Bible talks in those terms and terminologies. But at any rate, in verse 4 of Revelation 13, we see also a very disturbing reality of where nationalism can go. Because basically, even though this beast is a conglomerate, which indicates it is a socialistic, globalist government of 10 kings combining their power with one to give him the empowerment necessary to essentially influence the world and even have an effect on the whole world, we see here in verse 4 that people reverence this dictator so much, they worship the dragon that gave power to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like unto the beast who's able to make war with him?" So through the vicarious worshiping of the dictator, they're actually worshiping the dragon that's empowering the dictator. This is nationalism gone awry. This is state worship. This is to say that our king, our prime minister, our president is the man, and we're going to worship him because he's so great, he's so good. That's nationalism gone awry. But yet, the formation of the government, I want you to understand the distinction, the formation of the government is a conglomerate of 10 kings, as we read in Revelation 17. And I know I'm interweaving this, but I'm trying to give you a big picture at the same time as we bring these things down in parallel, that it is a socialistic government with a combine of 10 kings pooling their assets, pooling their power together to support this dictator, this autocrat that we're told that makes war with Jesus, with the King of Kings. But let's just stay focused here in Revelation 13 for a moment. Let's not veer off this. So they worship him. In verse 5, there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things, blasphemies, and power was given to him for 3.5 years, 42 months. He opens his mouth, he blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. He's got no reverence for anything that is God-oriented. It was given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And John is writing this. John is talking in terminology of the church, the New Testament church. So he's calling the church, who's the church? The people, right? So he's calling saints the church. And he's saying that this thing is going to have its way with the people, with the church members. That's what we're basically reading here. They're the saints. He says that, and it was given to him to make war, this is verse 7 of chapter 13, Revelation, make war with the saints and to overcome them. So he is going to have a successful persecution on them. They're going to suffer. They are indeed going to suffer. And he says power was given to him over, look at this, kindreds, that's ethnicities, languages, and different nations. So this beast that is basically driven by demons, it's a demonic-driven system, is going to be so charismatic and powerful that the people are going to worship it. Obviously, the saints who don't receive the mark, we understand, remember, the beast is going to mark these people, and if you get the mark, then that means you're on its side. If you don't get the mark, obviously you're not on its side. You'll be persecuted. You'll suffer consequences. So it's an assumed fact here, and you're going to see that here later in chapter 13, that obviously these saints who the beast was having its way with did not receive the mark, because we're going to be introduced here to the mark in a minute. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. And I want you to understand that. All on the earth, all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And if any man has an ear, let him hear. He that leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He that kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. So these are the consequences that are going to come upon those that the beast is going to have its way. So then we get told here this other beast comes on the scene. It has two horns, representative of both sides of government. And in this case, it's civil as well as ecclesiastical or religious. And he goes on, he says he exercises the power of the first. So as I said, he's got legislative power. He's got the ability to make laws and change times. before him. He causes the earth and them that dwell thereon to worship the first beast. So he has the ability and the agenda to get the people to worship the government. That's what we're being told here. He's actually the spokesman. He's the surrogate to cause the people to recognize the credibility of the civil government and its agenda or its position to protect the people. And so in this particular case, we're told that the strength and the influence of this second beast here introduced to us, that we find out later on rides the beast and is characterized as a cohort and is actually characterized as a female, which we understand in prophetic writ is representative of ecclesiastical authority. So here in this case, but that's in chapter 17, which we'll get to here in a moment. But he goes on here and he says, he exercised all the power of the first beast, causes them on the earth that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So now we are told, and it is reiterated for us and brings our attention back to verse 3, that this beast's wound now is healed. And it's not healed, we're not talking about Justinian in 554 AD. We're talking about end times here. We're talking about a healing of this Romanish, Greco-Babylonish system that is called Mystery Babylon. It's not called the Ottoman Empire. It's not called by a Muslim name. It's called by its original roots, its original genesis. And its original genesis was in Babylon, and it morphed into a Mede and Persian and then Greco-Macedonian, ultimately Roman Empire. And that Roman Empire, and this is why in these patterns here that we see the tether or the connection, that this is not, the King of the North is not a Muslim empire or a Muslim power. It is outside of that. Now, could the King of the South be a Muslim power? Could the King of the South be an Arab power? Absolutely. Why do I say that? Because Egypt, the pattern shows Egypt was indeed the king of the south. The pattern was the king of the south in Egypt. What's Egypt today? It's a Muslim country. Now that we're down the road in the 21st century, and we've gone through all these centuries previous, and Muhammad came on the scene, remember, in about 640-something AD, because there was no Muhammad back in John's day. There was no Muhammad back in Daniel's day. Islam was not even a religion. There was no such thing. So the fact of it is, the Muslim religion is a new, what you could call a version. It's a new player on the screen, so to speak, to where certainly it can become part of the adhesion for the King of the South, but the King of the North, the patterns are really strong. You're going to see how much stronger they get here as we begin to unfold this a little bit. So we go back to 13. He does wonders so that he makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. Now, some people have taken that to be a figure of speech, of some kind of an allegory representing something as a figure of speech. Others have taken it literally. But I'll tell you this. If you saw on television the pontiff, the Catholic Church, many people think the Catholic Church is losing ground and so forth, but all it would take would be some kind of proposed miracle of this type of sort and magnitude, and I'll tell you what, you got people already worshiping the ground the guy walks on, and all he's doing is walking, let alone calling fire down from heaven. If he was able to perform some kind of a miracle such as that would be so stunning, I mean, people would be falling on their knees and face down to him in a New York minute, as they would say. So, a lot of this, remains to be seen in terms of how it actually plays out. But you're going to see something here with regard to the Catholic Church and the Pope, the institution of the Pope, the pontiff, the institution, because it's an institution. He stands in place of Peter as the one who represents Jesus Christ on earth. And I've got quotes here, for instance, as Pope... one of the popes claimed that, Pope Innocent III, he was the one who claimed that he stood between God and man. You talk about the arrogance. I mean, that is arrogant of all arrogance. Pope Innocent III, I stand before God and man, you've got to come through me, you know. This was the Catholic Church in the 8th century. That's when the Catholic Church started buying up property, started exercising civil authority. Up until the 8th century, mid part of the 8th century, it was pretty much, admittedly, an ecclesiastical organization, and most people associated with the Catholic Church were there for religious reasons. But the Catholic Church, all along the way, through up until the 8th century, which was around 700 or so AD, the fact remained, was always lobbying the civil government, whatever civil government it could lobby, to kill the Judaizers, to get rid of those that would not submit to the Pope's authority and the definition of what the Catholic Church, which was basically the universal church's representation. So it always exercised or had influential power, for lack of a better term, influential effect on the people that would not concede to its line of thinking, to its statement of beliefs, and to its ecclesiastical dictates. And so it's something in the history of understanding the Catholic Church, its relationship to civil law, and its ability to leverage civil law even when it didn't have its own civil authority to exercise law, to affect law on others for penalties to be ensued on those individuals that didn't abide by their religious theology. And that's dangerous. And that led up all the way to about the 8th century. In the 8th century, it turned, and the Catholic Church, all the civil leaders and so forth, would honor and look to the Catholic Church for guidance and for statements to determine what they should exercise in terms of penalties and laws to be enforced. That's how much it welled in terms of its authority and was able to acquire property. That's why it got so rich. That's why it became a nation. You know, the Vatican's a nation. It's its own country. You know, it has its own laws, its own sovereignty. It has its own army. You know, the Honorable Guard, I don't know what they call it, but it's very independent. It's a sovereign nation. And so here we see this thing going on. In the latter days, it's going to take on a manifestation whereby in verse 14 it says, it deceives them that dwell on the earth. It deceives them by means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the civil government, in the sight of the dictator, in sight of the one who understands the dark sentences. And you'll see that in Daniel 8, when the beast, the actual dictator, the actual autocrat, is described and profiled, and as we will see later on too, in Daniel 11, this beast and this dictator, this autocrat, this civil leader is going to be described as well. But here we're seeing the description of the relationship between the ecclesiastical side of the coin and the civil side of the coin. And so we go on here, that apparently, and this is why, for what it's worth, it'll get you a cup of coffee and a donut, but I kind of believe in verse 13 it's a literal description of fire coming down from heaven, because it seems as though we're validated by in verse 14 where we're told that he deceives them that dwell on the earth. Verse 14, I'll just reread it. By the means, or forget that, by the means, forget that, that was added. Let's just read it the way it is in the actual manuscripts. And deceives them that dwell on the earth by those miracles. See, the meaning doesn't change. By those miracles which he, that second beast, the one up in verse 11 that's described, he had power to do in sight of the beast. In other words, in sight of the first beast, the autocrat. So this ecclesiastical beast, who has the two horns and represents its intermingling, its fornication between civil and religious, has the ability to conduct, to execute, initiate miraculous sightings. And he does it in front of the civil leader, the civil autocrat, the civil one who's running the operation, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by the sword and did live. So here we're told clearly that the wounded beast, which would be the civil government, this autocrat, the second beast says, make an image unto that first beast. That's who we want you to make an image. Much like what, who was it, Nebuchadnezzar, who wanted them to bow down, Daniel to bow down to the image. And Daniel got caught, remember, not bowing. And similar, history repeating itself here in this regard, and which had the wound by a sword and did live. Now, verse 15, he had power to give life unto the image of the beast. And this is where I kind of fall off. Again, a cup of coffee and a donut will get you. I think this is a figure of speech because it gives life to the first beast, where people perceive that this thing is worthy of worship, it's worthy of credibility, it's everything that they want and that they could imagine. It provides them security. And so he had the power to give life or breath into the image of the beast, and the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. I think that's rather figurative. I might be more conservative than others, rather than taking a stone image or some kind of a concrete or onyx or maybe even gold image coming to life and talking. I'm not sure I'd go that far to buy this kind of a statement to indicate that. I think it's more figurative, but again, like I said, that's just purely my own interpretation of that, because I think you can make the case that because we've been told all along in verse 11 through 14 that the purpose of that second beast is to provide a credibility to the first beast, to get the people convinced it's worthy of worship. And the second beast, in verse 11 we were introduced, the ecclesiastical beast, is purposed to provide a means by which the people will find such honor and esteem in that autocrat that they will listen to the ecclesiastical leadership and actually worship the government, worship the autocrat himself, the dictator. They work as a team. They work as a team. Verse 16 now. He causes all poor, causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, and here it is now, to receive a mark. And this goes back, again, as I said, and I'm just kind of relayering this over so you see where I was coming from when I was talking about verse 7 of Revelation 13. It was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And that is in regards to the fact, it's an assumed, certainly understanding, they did not receive this mark. Because we're told later on, if you receive this mark, God is, he's as serious as a heart attack about this. You are not going in the kingdom. Because that's a cut, cold, black and white decision that God is looking for you to make, if indeed you're alive at this time, for Him. And if you go ahead and you proceed with taking that mark, as far as God is concerned, you're committing to the worship of this beast. You've made your choice, and He, for all intents and purposes, if you know better, you're done. That's right, you're done. And we see that later on in Scripture here in a moment. But at any rate, he goes on here, and he says, to receive this mark, verse 16, and their right hand or in their foreheads, which is very symbolic of work and thought, and that no man might buy or sell. So there's a consequence here. If you don't receive this mark, if you're not part of this sociocrat system, you're not going to be able to work. You're not going to be able to make a living. You're not going to be able to find lodging and food. You're going to be hunted. You're going to be on the outside looking in, and as a result, have a very hard time in being able to assimilate into the system. And so the name of the beast, or the number of the name, here's wisdom, let him that has understanding count the number of the beast, for the number of a man, and the number is 666, or 666. And the number 6 in numerology of God, in biblical numerology, is the number of man. 3 sixes would indicate certainly complete man. This is a completely humanistic and completely secular man-made system, and it's confirmed to be completely man-made, 666. I know a lot of people, I even got the calculation here where they go 666, tallies up to Rome and so forth and so on, and that's all fine and dandy, interesting arithmetic and numerology. I'm not going to necessarily go there simply because it's certainly up for debate. But one thing I do know, the number 6 is the number of man in biblical numerology, and there's 3 6s, and the number 3 is the number of completeness. Number 7 is the number of perfection. Number 12 is the number of perfect governmental beginnings. Number 2 is unity. Number 3, I think, is discourse. No, number 5, I think, is discourse. Number 3 is completeness. But at any rate, there is a numerology in the Bible, which, of course, is quite interesting in itself to be aware of and to know. And in this case, 666, without a doubt, is a system that is stamped and tattooed as a man-made system, hence why God doesn't want you to be a part of it. It goes without saying, do not be a part of this man-made system. This man-made system is Antichrist, and that's why. It's Antichrist, and there's no place for a Christian to be in that system. So it's important, I think, going back now to Daniel 7, that we begin to understand that some of this symbology was clarified some 600 years later by John. And if you were alive in Daniel's time, and Daniel introduced this vision he had to you at the time of his life, in his lifetime, in his timeline, no more than he knew what he was seeing, because we are told he didn't understand it either, would you understand what he's explaining? Because it wasn't meant for Daniel to understand. It wasn't meant for whoever he told about this or whoever he shared the writing with to understand. And it really wasn't for those until the end times come upon them for them to understand. That end time generation would begin to understand. And even us in this latter day that we could call the latter days don't understand it completely. We still see it somewhat darkly through a glass, darkly. And so we struggle in some areas. But looking back at some of the history we have, we can definitively begin to identify some of the historical markers along the way to give us the direction and at least the pointing to where this stuff is heading in a general and a broad fashion. So here we read that this, in verse 8 of Daniel 7, description of this fourth beast, we're told, is after considering the horns, that this little horn, whom there were 3 of the first plucked up by the roots, and behold, in his horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. And yes, the mouth did indeed, as you will see here as we proceed, speak great things. As a matter of fact, this little horn becomes more stout than even in some cases the autocrat himself, because he claims to leverage the authority of God. And there's no indication, by the way, that even the dictator, the autocrat, believes in God. But the fact of it is, this little horn here is definitely an ecclesiastical connection to that civil government that he is attempting to get the people to worship. Now, in verse 9, it's interesting, because verses 1 through 8 give us the board. That defines the board. If we were playing Monopoly, we unpack the box, we lay down the board, and we see all of the squares and all of the workings of the game. Here we see the board. The board is now defined for the end time prophetic unfolding, unpacking. Takes us all the way to the return of Christ. Takes us all the way. These 4 beasts represent now the board that takes us to the return of Jesus Christ. And God started it, and the only thing that seems to make sense as to why God starts here to define the prophetic method, the prophetic definition of when to start, is because there is no nation of Israel. It's almost as though he repeats history as he did with the Noachian deluge. he cleared the board of mankind, right? He had Noah build an ark, and he started over. He said, enough is enough. I've had it. I'm filled up to my eyeballs with this. So he takes Noah and his family, his 3 boys and their wives and his own wife. He builds a boat, puts the animals of choice in the boat, 7 of clean and 2 of the unclean, and they are saved. They come outside on the other side of the flood and start all over. Well, in this case, Israel failed. As far as God was concerned, like the Noachian deluge, God was concerned with the world. The world failed him. Israel failed him. He wiped the board clean. He took the Assyrians and used them to take the 10 tribes out. And 120 years later, he grabbed Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar and took the Jews out. Cleared the board. There is no organized nation of Israel on planet Earth right now in Daniel's day. Daniel's incarcerated, basically, and not incarcerated in the sense of jail, but he's a captive, and he's up in the king's court. Ezekiel's down by the river Kibar with his family and so on. And, of course, Jeremiah, he's up to his neck in muck over in Israel, in Palestine, Jerusalem, in the area there. He's in the front lines. These 3 guys are alive at the same time, contemporary to each other, each doing their own ministry, receiving visions independently of each other. I don't know if they talked with one another. I do know that Daniel, though, had access to the writings of Jeremiah. I do know that, because guess what? Daniel, as we understand, recognized, as we already read, the 70 years of captivity. And then he knew Cyrus was alive. And I've often said, you can imagine, wow, the excitement. Cyrus, I read it, he's alive. We're in captivity. And Jeremiah said 70 years. Now, if I could just figure out when the years began, I can figure out when we're going to be released. He was probably really excited about that, I would think. I would. I know I would be if I recognized that stuff and connected the dots and made those connections. But at any rate, he's here, continues writing, and all of a sudden, we take a quantum leap and are assured, in verse 9, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, that's the thrones of these kingdoms, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, the hair on his head like pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, his wheels as burning fire. A fiery stream issued, came forth from before him. Thousands and thousands ministered to him. 10,000s of 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set. The books were opened. I beheld then, because of the voice of the great words which the horn spoke, I beheld even till the beast was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. And you go over here to Revelation, keep your thumb there in Daniel 7. I just want to bring your attention over here to Revelation 19, verse 19, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse, that's Jesus, the white horse, and against his army. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet. The 2 beasts, the 2. And wrought together and make war against him that sat on the horse, and the beast that was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, that's Revelation 13, remember that, with which he deceived them that had received the mark, it's all coming together now, and them that worshipped his image. These both, that is the false prophet, that is that second beast, and the autocrat, the one who understands dark sentences, they were thrown alive in the lake of fire burning with brimstone, and the remnant were slain. And the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh. So we see a correlation here, a correlation of Revelation 19 through 21, let's call it, and this verses 9, Daniel 7, 9 verses through 11. We see a correlation. So there's no doubt we're being introduced to the Ancient of Days, and in this context, we understand who throws the beast and the false prophet in, and in this case, we find that that's Jesus Christ, and of course, we're going to see some interplay here with the Father, because we're going to be told, interestingly enough, of something else after this happens in verse 11. We read in verse 12, as concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, the Greco-Macedonian, has the rest of the beasts, because we're still, remember, we're in sequence here, and verse 9 is tethered to the fourth beast. So obviously the question is, well, what happened to the other beasts? What's going on with the lion? What's going on with the bear? What's going on with the leopard with the four heads? Well, we're told right here, the rest of the beasts, they had their dominions taken away. And we understand they had their dominions taken away because history tells us the Medes beat up the Persians, or the Babylonians, and the Greeks beat up the Persians, and Rome beat up the Greeks. You know? So it all took care of itself in that respect, historically speaking. That's our vantage point. That's our vantage point looking back now from the 21st century back into this venue that we're reading about here. And we can see that. Daniel didn't see this. He was given the information, but he didn't understand it. Matter of fact, he even admits he didn't understand some of this stuff. He says here, verse 28 of Daniel 7, "Hitherto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter to myself." And other versions, it just says he got sick, threw up. He was so disturbed over all this. He was actually physically upset, disturbed, and sick. You know, he couldn't even hold it down. So he sees all this. He's a conduit of all this information, but he doesn't understand a bit of it. He goes on here in verse 13, and he says, "And I saw the night vision." Remember, this is a night vision. This was actually, some commentators will tell you, in verse 7, it says, "After this, in the night visions." And there's an indication that in Daniel 7, verse 1, he says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel spoke and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven strove upon a great sea," and they proceed through here. And then it says in verse 7, "After this I saw in the night visions," and many scholars will tell you this is a second vision that was attached to the first vision that described the first three kingdoms. It's like this fourth beast is actually separated in a separate vision from the previous three. They can be closely the same. They can be closely the same. Could be. Yeah, it could be. Yeah. Visions can also be where you're conscious, but you're like in a hallucinatory state as opposed to sleeping, dreaming. Yeah, yeah. So he goes on here and he says, "I saw in the night vision, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with the clouds of heaven and came to the Ancient of Days. And they brought him near before him." And here, obviously, we see one identified as the Son of Man and comes to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And here, immediately, now you begin to get this impression that the Ancient of Days is the Father. The Son of God is coming to the Ancient of Days. Now, this obviously is before Jesus was incarnate. This vision here is before Jesus was incarnate. And so Daniel's seen in this vision two beings that are interacting with one another, that are coming together at this time. Now, when you compare that, go with me here to Psalms 110. Psalms 110. And the reason I want to share this with you is because I want to indicate to you how the idea of the Word living before His incarnation is in fact interlaced in the Old Testament. Because this is a major indication that these two beings are working in tandem throughout the course of human history. And even David in the book of Psalms in 110, we go over here and we read this. "The Lord," and that is Yahweh, "said unto my Lord." Now that English translation comes from the Hebrew Adon. So Yahweh said unto my Adon. And in the Hebrew, Adon means controller. It means master. it means owner or sovereign leader, but definitely and not necessarily deity. So, it's important to recognize, Yahweh, the Lord, said unto my Adon, sit you at my right hand. Oh, who's sitting at Yahweh's right hand? Adon, a controller, a sovereign being, a being who is in essence a master, but still no indication that deity is divine. Read on. Sit you at my right hand until I make thy enemies your footstool. So Yahweh is telling Adon, sit here until I make your enemies my footstool. So you get this idea that Yahweh is talking to Adon. And Yahweh is telling Adon, don't worry about it, you're going to be okay until I make your enemies my footstool. So Yahweh is in control here. He says, the Lord, Yahweh, shall send the rod of your strength. Your strength. Adon's strength. Wow. So this Adon is somebody, he's a master, he's a controller, but he's something special because Yahweh is standing up with him. Yahweh is standing up for him. Yahweh is, kind of sticking up for him and telling him, you've got it going for you here. So he says, Yahweh, verse 2 now, the Yahweh shall send the rod of your strength, Adon, that's what he's talking about, out of Zion, rule you in the midst of your enemies. Your people shall be willing in the day of your power in the beauties of holiness. From the womb of the morning, you have the dew of your youth. Yahweh has sworn this. That's the Father again. Yahweh has sworn this and will not repent. I not change. You are a priest forever. Adon, that's who he's talking about. You, Adon, are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Well, now we know who he's talking about. Come on. He's got to be more than Adon, right? This is interesting Hebrew. When you get into this original, watch how this now goes. So, verse 5, Adonai, that's what we're looking for. Not Adon, not Yahweh, Adonai, a third Hebrew word now. Adonai, at thy right hand shall strike through kings in the day of his wrath. Now we've got a Hebrew word that definitively is without question deity. So not only is Adon a controller, a master, a sovereign, separate being, not a trinity, but he is a divine Adonai. So he is Adon, the Adonai, the divine. He is divine. And he sits at the right hand, and he's going to strike out. He shall judge among the heathen. He shall fill the places with dead bodies. Who? Yahweh? No. Adonai. Adonai. He's coming with a sword on a white horse, taking no prisoners. And that's what he's doing here. He's saying, he shall judge among the heathen. He shall fill the places with dead bodies. He shall wound the heads over many countries. He shall drink of the brook in the way, therefore shall he lift up the head. So here you have Nicodemus coming by night to Jesus. See how all this plays out? Nicodemus, a Pharisee, he's got all this background. He knows all these scriptures. What was the scriptures of the New Testament church? The Old Testament, right? What did Jesus represent? He represented an individual, a Jewish lad from the tribe of Judah, who was taught in the scriptures. What scriptures was Jesus taught in? The Old Testament. So Nicodemus, rightly so, a Pharisee, a teacher of teachers, comes to Nicodemus by night and he says, tell me, what are the secrets? Come on. You are a man of God. I've seen these miracles you've done. And so he gets into this conversation. And you could imagine the amount of stun, the amount of surprise, all of the things that came rushing into Nicodemus after he heard what Jesus explained to him there in John chapter 3. And it's no wonder why Nicodemus, after that conversation of who knows what else they talked about, because we got that one little segment about being born again. But the fact of it is, who knows? All I do know, though, is that Nicodemus was so convinced, and he knew this, and we're not told about what him knowing that when he knew this, because John 3 doesn't cover this, but we do know this. He was there with Joseph of Arimathea at the grave site when they took that body off the stake, and both Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb they used, it was a family tomb, put that body in that tomb. And I think, as sure as I'm standing here, Nicodemus was there because he knew Jesus told him at some point, somewhere along the line, whether it was that night at John 3, on another subject that they talked about that John didn't record, who knows, but the bottom line is, or another meeting at some point that is not recorded in your Bible, but he knew that Jesus was going to allegedly come back to life after him being dead. He was there, I think, he was there to make sure Jesus was there. He's probably poking the body saying, you make sure he's dead, you know. He's just making sure this guy was indeed dead, looking for breath, hitting him on the head a little bit, his cheeks, making sure that he was, out of it. But at any rate, we see in this case that Daniel 7, that we see indication these two beings that are working in tandem. Verse 14, and there was given him domination and glory and the kingdom, that all people, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed. Verse 15, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit, in the midst of my body, and the visions of my head troubled. He had a headache. He was sick again. His countenance was moved and disturbed, and he was just taken aback at all this, because from verses 1, Daniel 7:1, through Daniel 14, we are told a time sequence of historical magnitude that commences from the time when there is no nation of Israel any longer, no organized corporate nation of Israel no longer on planet Earth, commencing with Babylon, who took them out, last tribe, Judah, and maybe Benjamin and a few Levites. But the fact of it was, the Babylonians took the last remaining corporate entity known as Israel, which was Judah, the southern tribes, out. No corporate entity, no corporate nation left on planet Earth. They're all off the board now, and God now says, this is the beginning of the last days. I'm starting over. This is the beginning of the last days. Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greco-Macedonian, Rome, and it'll stretch out till my son Adonai comes back and makes his enemies my footstool. It's great stuff. This story is so, you could make such a neat movie out of all of this when you really get down to it, because it's so rich in imagery and meaning, and what's so stunning, it's real. It's real. And we're a part of it. And we're down toward the end here, which is cool, because we can Monday night quarterback a little bit clearer than these guys were able when they were in the woods. They couldn't see a lot of this because a lot of this stuff didn't happen yet. Whereas with us, we're down near the end game here, and we're looking back, seeing how all that stuff played out and matching it up uniquely enough. And that's why I find prophecy so cool, because it's a proof that the Bible is valid, legitimate. It's proof. Fulfilled prophecy proves the Bible's legitimacy without a doubt. And this is all further proof. So, verse 16, he says, I came near to one, that is, one of the angels, that was providing him the information. And the indication here could be that he was conscious in a dream state. And the angel was kind of talking with him. They were in communication. He may have even been seeing this angel, because he says here in verse 16, I came near unto one of them that stood by. So there must have been more than one. I don't know. He came near to one. That indicates there was more than one. I don't know if there were 2 or 3 or 4. Maybe there was a half a dozen. Maybe there was a bunch of them sitting on chairs all watching the whole thing unfold. I don't know. But I do know this. Daniel got up and walked toward one and asked him the truth of all this. So he told me and made me know the interpretation of the things. Verse 17. Here it is in a nutshell, Daniel. The angel says this to him. These great beasts which are four kings, they're kingdoms, which shall arise out of the earth. Babylon, the Medes and the Persians, the Greco-Macedonian, and Roman empires. These are 4 kings that will rise out of history and become the legacy of mankind. He says here, But the saints, and this is the good news, this is the short version, this is the abbreviated version. The saints of the Most High shall take the kingdom, possess the kingdom, forever, even forever and ever. So here's the short version. These are 4 kings that are going to come up on the earth, and they're going to rise. But guess what? We win in the end. The good guys win. End of story. What else is there to say? That's all that counts. The good guys win, game over. You know, we rule forever and ever as living, breathing, powerful, empowered spirit beings. And as we understand Scripture, we see that clearer. But he says in verse 19, I would know the truth of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, whose teeth were of iron as nails of brass, which devoured, broke in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. So Daniel's not exactly satisfied with that, conclusion. That's kind of fast. So he wants to know more about this 4th beast. And that's where we'll pick up the next time here, because time's run out. So we'll pick up here on verse 19 with the 4th beast and continue in more detail with regards to this and illustrate exactly just how definitive this other beast that we were introduced to in Revelation 13 is so important in its association with the autocrat on the civil side of this beast that will rise in the end times. We'll get into more of that as well. So we'll pick up next time. I think it'll be in June next month, around the 18th or so. I forget now exactly, but we'll pick up there on Dan 7, verse 19.